Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to begin today's presentation of the Kirk webinar series entitled Diversion Upstream, Working with Purchasing to Prevent Waste. My name is Eric Halverson. I'm the program coordinator for the College and University Recycling Coalition, and I'll be your moderator for today's program. For those of you not familiar with Kirk, the College and University Recycling Coalition is a member-based organization that works to grow collegiate recycling and waste reduction efforts by fostering technical information exchange and networking opportunities between the staff and student leaders, implementing programs on college and university campuses. So today's program is part of our free Kirk webinar series, which is designed to highlight innovative campus programs and provide trends and perspectives on a broad range of operational and educational topics related to collegiate recycling and sustainable materials management. Today's program is the sixth and final webinar in our 2021 series, so a very special welcome to everyone here today. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping notes to go over. If you have problems with your audio or video during the webinar, we recommend you visit support.zoom.us. You can troubleshoot any technical issues there. And to avoid background noise, we have placed all but our panelists' lines on mute today, we encourage you to please submit questions at any time using the question and answer section of the Zoom dashboard below. And we will read as many of these as possible out loud to our speakers at the end of each presentation. Copies of today's presentation slides will be available to download and a recording available to stream within the next day or so from the Kirk website, which is www.curc3r.org. Similar to our last webinar on promoting reuse and messaging, this webinar is focused on preventing waste, but today we will be talking about purchasing power, how to understand our waste impact, and also some ideas for ways to divert materials from the waste stream working with purchasing. So colleges are uniquely capable of controlling not only how our waste is sorted, but how it's procured in the first place. So hopefully after this, we can work smarter, not harder, and limit our waste before it reaches the bin. So first, we will hear from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Today, we are joined by Brian Goldberg, the Assistant Director of the MIT Office of Sustainability, and Emma Homstad from MIT Strategic Sourcing, and a Program Coordinator of Small and Diverse Business. Then we will hear from Rebecca Grekin, a graduate student in Stanford University's Department of Energy Resources Engineering and the Benson Lab. So now let's introduce our first presentation. Brian helps to lead MIT's Office of Sustainability in its mission to transform MIT into a powerful model that generates just, equitable, and scalable solutions for responding to the unprecedented challenges of a changing planet. Brian's portfolio includes helping MIT develop systems and operational processes for designing out waste through a materials life cycle. Emma Homstad is the program coordinator for the Small, Diverse, and Sustainable Business program at MIT. She works both internally and externally to help campus purchasers find purchasing options that advance the Institute's priorities around diverse, equitable, and sustainable buying. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and a Master's in Urban Environmental Planning from Tufts University. So welcome, MIT.
Great, nice to be here. I just have to move my screen over so I can hit project, and hopefully you can see my first slide. Is that good? Great.
Looks good.
Thanks. So it's great to be with you all. Hope you're preparing for the holidays. So today, as one of the final exciting talks before this break, we're really excited to just share what's in progress. We don't have all the answers at MIT. We're just continuing to try to grapple with these same challenges that I think so many of you are grappling with on your campuses. And we hope to share some of the lessons that we're learning about how we're both linking our efforts to design out waste on the waste side of things, but also how to drive that up and make decisions and actions and interventions in our purchasing that might also drive down waste, because if we're purchasing less and we're purchasing differently, then we're designing out waste. Thought what better than to do that than to bring both me and my partner in crime, Emma, who works more on the purchasing side of things. So you'll hear from both of us today. Just for a kind of a context, so you can put MIT's story with relationship to whatever institution you're from. We're about 25,000 kind of people in total. It's kind of a small city, spread out over just a 168-acre campus. It's not very big, but it's very dense and compact in an urban area just across the river from Boston. And we have a lot of decentralized purchasing. There are at least 450 individual departments, labs, and centers. And each of those labs and departments and centers are making their own decisions about purchasing. On a typical year, we purchase about 100,000 different items, computers, cords, tables, desks. We also generate at least 3,000 tons of trash, and then a few more thousand tons of other material that is recycled and composted. But I flagged here that of the trash itself, still about 50% of it, we can do a better job recycling and capturing out our food waste. So we got a long way to go on there. We have a lot of property in our surplus and property on our campus that can continue to be reused, and a lot of spend on goods and services. So part of the presentation today, if you take nothing else from what can we learn from MIT, it's that there's me and there's Emma, and I sit in the group called MITOS, the MIT Office of Sustainability, and we're focused on how do we look across the whole campus and modify the systems on campus, in this case, to design out waste. And we can't just look at the recycle bin and the food waste bin. We have to drive up to what's the material coming into the institute. And that's where I partner with Emma, who will introduce herself and pick it up from here to talk about Emma's role. And then it'll come back to me, and I'll flag a whole bunch of different kinds of initiatives that we're undertaking in partnership. So Emma, take it away, and I'll advance when you tell me.
Yeah, so hi everybody, I'm Emma Homstad. As Brian said, we work closely together on making our purchases at MIT much more sustainable. I was a former fellow in Brian's office thinking about all this work, and when a position opened up kind of focused on this, I was happy to move into the Vice President for Finance office, VPF. And so what we are able to do at VPF is we engage directly with the vendors. So these are the folks who are actually bringing these materials, goods, and services onto campus, and looking at what we can do on the back end to kind of communicate the values and priorities that Brian's group convenes folks on campus around. Brian, next slide, please. So we're really leveraging our vendors in this way. So how do we use all of the tools that they have at their disposal when they're communicating with end users and purchasers on campus? And how do we kind of institutionalize those tools? So one of the ways that we're doing that is going through each of our contracts and thinking about how we can mitigate the language to make it focus more on sustainability. One of the ways we've done this is through the competitive bid process. We make sustainability a key evaluative criteria. We look at price parity between conventional items and more sustainable, the environmentally preferable items. We focus on those mechanisms that vendors have in communicating with end users, like green shopping lists, email campaigns, that kind of stuff. And then we also think about service provision. So what does it look like to have a sustainable service coming onto campus? Maybe that looks like in an electric vehicle delivery truck. Maybe it looks like reduced or recycled packaging or take backs of hard to recycle items. Next slide, please. So one of these was our most recent office supply competitive bid. This was a really exciting bid for us. We hadn't competed our office supply contract in quite a while. And part of my job is also to think about how we leverage small local vendors as well. So we split our RFP into two pieces. We had a proposal from a large company and one from a small local company. We were able to kind of separate out the requirements for each of these things in order to maximize what each company was able to provide more easily and readily. With the large vendors, we ensured that there were strict sustainability requirements that they had to meet. Whereas with the smaller vendor, we were looking more at customer service provision, ease of returns, that desktop delivery, all the service things that people really like. On our large side, the award went to the vendor that had the most competitive green pricing, more options in terms of the green items they were able to offer, electric vehicle delivery, and then comprehensive reporting. So I could go back and say, okay, year over year, we're increasing the number of items on our frequently purchased list that have environmentally preferable qualities. I'm able to take what Brian's learning from campus, go back to our supplier and say, hey, we need to see more of this. We're really using this strategy with other consumable vendors on campus. Because MIT is a private organization, we don't have any type of state mandates, unlike a lot of our peers in the large research university space. So we kind of have to figure out ways to do this without those the help of that legislative obligation. So if you want to keep going, Brian. And one of the biggest things that we hear on campus, and something that Brian's found during waste audits, is that there's too much packaging. So I wanted to just speak a little bit about this particular issue. And I think all of us have experienced this at one time or another, where you buy something and it gets shipped in a huge box, or it comes with tons of little plastic bits and you just don't know where to take it. But imagine that happening on the scale of a massive institution where we're getting hundreds of deliveries every day. So this is feedback that I think our vendors have really appreciated hearing, and they hear it all over. It's not just from MIT, it's from our colleagues and peers at other organizations as well. And we've seen that a lot of these vendors are responding proactively with reduced packaging, sometimes with reusable tote programs, sometimes thinking about, for us, lab supplies are a key area where we see a lot of waste, thinking about how they can reduce waste in the lab supply provision. This also looks like encouraging that recycling and take back sometimes of those packaging materials themselves. All right, next slide. And I think, Brian, I'm going to kick it back to you to talk about one of our research projects that we've been doing.
Great, thanks, Emma. So we'll certainly welcome your questions. At the end, I'm going to walk through a few of the different projects now that kind of building on what Emma launched here. And one of the efforts that we've used is it's sort of thinking on the waste side of who's our partner on campus, who's actually the contracted partner for managing our waste. Are they a partner with us in actually thinking through how to design out waste? And the more we study the waste on campus and the waste processes, we realize we really need a partner in our waste hauler who is committed to designing out waste. So then we can work more easily with Emma and others to drive up the supply chain. So one of the first steps we did was actually a new RFP that was loaded with for waste services, that was loaded with lots of sustainability services as well. And that was using our purchasing power to develop an RFP and seek a hauling partner who could provide more sustainability services around waste hauling. And so that was one starting point. And we've now are 2 years into this new contract, and we're able to nail down and focus into things like, what are the contaminants in our recycling and our food waste collection? And we're noticing that there are things like styrofoam. That's a real problem. So how do we now communicate with our vendors for things we're buying? Let's design out the styrofoam. It's a problem on the waste side. And there are many other benefits that have emerged from this contract. Emma and I are engaged in a year-long study with students, master students in the Sustainable Supply Chain group on campus. These master students, for their capstone project, are trying to close the loop on office supplies. They've essentially asked, well, how can the office supply contracts that Emma has now set up, how can that office supply vendor drive more sustainable activities into our purchasing? And what we're finding is there's both opportunities, some of what Emma's identified on using different purchasing tools. There's also opportunities on the waste side. How do we make it easier for people on campus to bring recycled items, hard to recycle items that vendors are taking back, like print and toner cartridges or other kinds of materials that are harder to recycle? Can we have our office supply vendor take more responsibility and make it easier for those items to get taken back? At the same time, can we use things like stock rooms that are distributed to enable less packaging to come into the Institute to begin with? Because if people don't have to place an order for 3 pens, they can walk down the hall to a stock room that already has those pens. we believe there are savings in the process. So that study's ongoing, and we look forward to sharing results after the academic year when that's complete. Last year, we did a study with the same research group on campus, the Sustainable Supply Chain Group, to look at PPE. Everybody, all of you were buying PPE, and we asked the question, can we somehow be more sustainable in our purchasing of PPE? And the quick conclusion that the team reached is that no matter how many vendors talk about all the sustainable things of PPE, ultimately, all kinds of PPE is not really designed to be reused and recycled. And so the market didn't have offerings that gave us confidence across a range of PPE products. So we then shifted to look at the opportunities around centralization and how to reduce over ordering, because a lot of PPE can expire if it's not used in enough time. So how do we reduce and right size the demand with the supply to design out the waste? And we have some really good findings and a calculator on how to do this as well. Some of you may be familiar with Reaply. It's a third party that has an online tool. Reaply is research cheaply. It's designed to essentially match a bunch of things left over in a lab, like glass beakers, with someone else on campus who needs glass beakers. That match is done online. And then there's avoided purchasing and avoided waste. Simple concept, pretty simple interface. We've been testing it for a few years now, and it's fantastic. We've avoided purchasing of over $50,000 just by matching up things that one lab needed and another lab already had. We've also avoided over 600 items that were going to get tossed by someone. They've been recaptured. We're still figuring out how do we really grow this opportunity for reuse. We think Reaply is a good partner, but we got a lot more ways to go to drive engagement. This has been an interesting opportunity around centralizing waste bins. On the waste side, we found that the more that people have to just stand up from their desk, just like from their house, and go to one waste station in their house or one waste station in an office, they have to consciously think and place things in the right bins. And we're finding that avoids contamination issues in recycling and food waste. What we're also finding is centralizing the waste stations has dramatically reduced the number of plastic bags that are used to line bins in the first place. We have deployed centralized waste stations in a few buildings on campus. We can reduce the number of waste stations from every office having their own, and that was 500 bins in a building. We cut that down to 70 bins in total. But that led to about 40,000 fewer plastic bag liners that had to be purchased for that year. While it's not a huge cost savings, it's a pretty significant environmental benefit. And as we're deploying these systems in different buildings on campus, we have a little calculator that can help show how many bags are saved just by shrinking the number of waste stations available. So that's another fun effort that's going. And then I just put a list of a few others that have been really helpful to us. Just things like sustainable design standards. We're continuing to work with our facilities partners to integrate sustainable purchasing language into the specifications that designers have to meet for purchasing everything from wallboard to flooring to glass. And while LEED certainly picks up a lot of those pieces, these sustainable design standards can oftentimes go above and beyond LEED, because the gaming aspect of LEED may mean some things don't get covered. So sustainable design standards has been a great opportunity for us. Also working through AC stars to actually report on aspects of our sustainable purchasing and waste. That process alone has caused us to examine ourselves, collect data, ask further questions. Emma and I have participated in a number of similar groups. Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council's been a wonderful partnership group with us, with other peers dealing with the same challenges around Amazon packaging or waste issues. And we're working on those together. That's been a good partner. And as Emma noted, challenging our vendors to show what's possible. Just this final slide for those who are on a campus where you might be pushing a climate action plan. MIT has recently released our climate action plan, and boy, there's a lot of purchasing bubbles in here. So our climate action plan has 14 buckets for mitigation and resiliency, EV infrastructure, greenhouse gas portfolio, and climate leadership. But purchasing, I circled, I think this is red, I'm colorblind, but I put these circles in here. Purchasing and climate action picks off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 of the 14 buckets. So half of these buckets have a direct nexus with purchasing. And we see that as a great opportunity now, not only to drive climate action, but now to drive more sustainable purchasing along with climate action, because climate action has gotten a lot of attention on our campus. So I'm going to leave it here. We welcome your questions. Obviously, we couldn't cover half of what we really want to talk about, but if you want to talk further, we're happy to be reached afterwards as well. I'll hand it back to Eric, and Eric, let us know where to go from here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. We've got some great questions rolling in for you both. One of them I'd highlight first, maybe you can send it to Emma or Brian. Working directly with waste and recycling hauler sounds like a great idea to this person. Could you share some of the language you included in the RFP for that?
Yeah, I think this is referring to the, is this referring to our hauler RFP? Yeah, so we used everything from language that where we've expected the hauler to participate in regular sustainability meetings with us and have developed a sustainability work plan. Not just how do we generate less waste, but how do we actually generate less waste, and let's work with us together. So developing a work plan together with regular meetings. We've also asked the hauler to provide the data about our different streams of waste, and not only the data on how much we're generating, but from which location, so that we can start to see where we may have more problematic flows. And then we've also asked the hauler to be a constant source of education with us. So as we have questions about how the market's changing, how can the hauler very quickly help us understand how the market's changing so we can feed that back to our community? I'm happy to go into more detail offline, but I appreciate the question.
Yeah, thank you. And another question is asking about if MIT has an extended producer responsibility framework, or maybe Massachusetts in general as an area, and how that plays into your purchasing plans at MIT.
Emma, do you want to speak to this one, or do you want me to start?
You can start, because Mass doesn't have EPR, right?
I think there's a Mass EPR that I think applies to state purchasing for public entities. We do not have a policy as an institute, so in a sense, there's no regulatory framework around MIT's activities other than perhaps what the city of Cambridge might hope to do in the future. But we really would love to push EPR, and that's where, through the office supply example that Emma and I are researching with students, we're trying to build in EPR where it's feasible, and we just hope to drive more of that. So we're very keen to continue to drive it. We're also working with our research community to understand, where does EPR make sense? Where is it possible? And there's some good learnings from Maine, Maine's recent kind of regulatory work on this. So we're very supportive. We're just trying to figure out how to build it into our program.
Thank you. And then one final question for you both. Since we're talking about working with purchasing, working with Office of Sustainabilities, the relationship between your office and your working relationship between each other, is that something that you feel has been supported by MIT, and how do they do that? Or has it kind of been like a grassroots between the both of the offices just saying, hey, let's get together and work on this?
That's a good question. I think this is something that Brian and I talked about when we were thinking about how we wanted to shape our talk. So I think the way that this all kind of shook out was, I was working in the Office of Sustainability, but my current team now, the Vice President for Finance Office, really wanted to kind of go beyond the compliance obligations that we have when we're buying with small and diverse businesses with federal monies, and really expand that to all of MIT's funds. And it just so happened that I have a sustainability background when I got hired to do this work, and a great working relationship with Brian and the Office of Sustainability. And I think we were really able to justify that deep relationship between social, environmental, and economic justice, and frame out the Small and Diverse Business Program as one that also encompasses sustainability as just part and parcel of the work that we do to enhance economic justice, because so many folks who are inadvertently, well, and advertently impacted by these chemical manufacturers or the diesel trucks running through Cambridge every day are folks that are also historically disenfranchised when it comes to growing and starting businesses.
Thanks, Emma. And I would just add, just from a real, even from a real pragmatic place, there are enough people on our campus, and I imagine on many of your campuses, where they're the people who say, oh, I want to do the right thing when it comes to my coffee setup in our kitchen or our office supplies. And hey, purchasing, can you help us figure out the right thing to do? Or hey, sustainability, can you help us figure out the right thing to do? And so the purchasing, central purchasing, or Emma's procurement arm is hearing these questions, and we're hearing these questions. And so pragmatically, it just makes sense to sit together and say, okay, how do we bring together our sustainability knowledge with the frontline folks like Emma who work with our vendors to say, can we ask our vendors to do more here? Or is there an option? Is Keurig recycling doesn't seem like the best life cycle option compared to other options like a bulk coffee service. So how do we incentivize bulk coffee service setups over Keurig setups? Because the community is asking for this guidance. So those pragmatic opportunities to help answer the very questions to the communities that we're serving have also necessitated we work together. And maybe on your campuses, you'll find those are just really pragmatic excuses to get together with your purchasing partner, your sustainability partner, and try to solve a problem that some faculty member or some administrative group is squawking about. And that's how it works.
Absolutely. Thank you for that advice. You know, when you see an opportunity, jump on it and make a change. Thank you to everyone else who submitted questions. Emma and Brian will be looking through those, but we're going to move on to our second presentation for today. Now I'd like to introduce Rebecca Grekin. Rebecca is a current graduate student in the Benson Lab in the Energy Resources Engineering Department at Stanford University. Her research focuses on developing tools and methodologies to quantify and mitigate Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods. So welcome, Rebecca. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm really excited to be here. Let me share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Looks great.
Great. So perfect. All right, so thank you so much for that introduction. So as Eric mentioned, my thesis for my master's is broadly about quantifying emissions from purchased goods and developing methodologies related to doing that. But today I'm going to kind of be narrowing on a specific portion of the work that I did, which is looking at the Amazon purchasing data for Stanford and kind of how I went about extracting useful information from it. And so I'm really excited to be talking to you all today, and thank you very much for the invitation. So really quick, I'll just start with an introduction to something called UNSPSC codes, which I found to be very useful when looking at not only the Amazon data, but the data from other purchasing platforms as well. And then kind of look at a case study for how I was able to then extract that useful information from the Amazon purchasing data to actually, you know, come up with some solutions that might be useful and could be implemented for reducing emissions as well as waste. So to start off with, I think Stanford and MIT are very similar in that purchasing is very decentralized. And so it's important to if you as a university are trying to start looking at this kind of data, it's important to consider where your purchasing is happening. So depending on the university or even the department at Stanford, there's still lots of purchasing that can actually happen through different avenues. And so Stanford, for example, also uses something called Smart Mart, where there's also lots of things that are purchased directly through procurement, through like purchase orders, or even sometimes you have cases where you have an Amazon for Business account for the university, but you also have people who have personal Amazon accounts who then purchase things through their personal Amazon accounts and then request reimbursements. And it's really important to kind of consider what are the different types of things that could be purchased through all of these different avenues. And then consider also what your goals are in terms of what impact you're looking to have. And maybe that can help focus, which of these types of data sets you want to go after first. So for example, at Stanford, a majority of the laboratory equipment and supplies is actually purchased through SmartMart. So if Stanford decides that they want to do something big for the lab equipment and supplies, it wouldn't make any sense for Stanford to look at the Amazon data set. Instead, you want to kind of look at the SmartMart data set. So it's also important to consider kind of what your purpose is in looking at these data sets, since this goal kind of will influence how you approach these humongous data sets, because Ryan mentioned that there's more than $1 billion to spend at MIT per year on purchased items. Lots of other universities, it's a lot of spend, and so it's a lot of things being purchased. So you look at these data sets and they're huge. And so you have to prioritize things, and kind of defining a really good goal for what your goal for what you want to do with this data can really help make the data set a little bit more manageable. So, some of these goals can be quantifying emissions from the purchases, which is what my thesis is on. Are you trying to determine what the biggest contributors to emissions are from purchased goods so that you only have to focus on the big players? Or, for example, are you trying to specifically look at opportunities to reduce waste? And so I think Brian and Emma both mentioned opportunities for finding items that can be purchased in bulk to try and reduce, that packaging waste. And there's also opportunities for identifying items that may actually contribute to waste significantly at the campus, and in theory could be completely eliminated, or the purchasing of those items could be limited. And so it's also important to consider, these are a couple of examples of goals that I've had looking at these different data sets throughout my master's. But so maybe your university is actually trying to do something a little bit different. And so moving on to some of the data, and I know this looks pretty gross, but this is a screenshot of what the actual Amazon data set for Stanford looks like. And kind of the first step was determining what in these reports is actually useful, because they kind of have, like this data set has 50 columns, and I actually found out that only 5 were kind of useful for me. So obviously the order date, the product category, the title, which is the name of the item that was purchased, this UNSPSC code, which I will go into in just a second, and kind of the item subtotal, because we're looking at the spend for each of these different categories. So now let's go into a little bit what the UNSPSC code is. And so it stands for the United Nations Standard Products and Services Code. And they're basically a standardized set of codes that are meant to represent most, if not all, of the different categories of purchased goods and services. And they kind of have a simple rule set to them. So each code is made up of 8 digits, and then each group of 2 digits provides progressively more detail. And so the first 2 digits here are called the segment, and give a general category for the item. So in this example here, we're looking at office equipment and accessories and supplies. And so basically any UNSPSC code that starts with the digit 44 is an office equipment, an accessory, and supplies. Then you move on to the next 2 digits, and those represent something called the family, which goes into a little bit more detail. So here now we know it's office machines, not just office equipment. Moving on to the class, you get 2 more digits. Now it has something to do with printers and photocopier supplies. And then finally, if you have all 8 digits of a code, you get to a pretty high level of detail. And in this case, it's just the printer ribbon. And so you can see that with like 8 digits, using these UNSPSC codes, you can get quite to a fine level of detail. And I say that you can have up to 8 digits, but basically sometimes these codes, if you have 44 and then 6 zeros, that is a valid UNSPSC code. It's just a very general one. And so in the particular case with Amazon, at least with the data sets and the purchasing that happens for Stanford, they're actually pretty good about requiring their vendors to input the UNSPSC code in order to sell on Amazon. So actually only about 1.2% of the items that were purchased through Amazon don't have any information for the UNSPSC code. But there's also more than 3,000 unique UNSPSC codes present in the data set that I have been working with. And so even though Amazon's pretty good about having some level of detail for the UNSPSC codes, it's not so great at requiring the highest level of detail. So you can see that only 30% of the items that were purchased in 2019 at Stanford through Amazon have, the highest level of detail, but 62% have kind of the class, which is the one before. And so depending on, again, what your goals are for looking at this data set, this lack of detail could be pretty important if you're trying to find like specific items that you want to target for whatever it is that your goals are. But if you're trying to determine, okay, most of our spend is in office supplies, this level of detail is fine. And then this is just a different way to kind of visualize the UNSPSC codes. And so I've kind of included the 10 largest groups for each of the levels of detail. So other here is all of the different other categories for that level of detail added together, whereas null means that there was no data. So basically it means that all of the items that fall into this null category only have 2 digits in the segment case, and then everything else is zeros. And so there's not, and you can quickly see how you end up with not much detail at the commodity level. And something that I think is important to consider is also how you're getting this purchasing data. So this was something that was specifically extracted from the Amazon for Business account for Stanford. There is also some purchasing data that's available through an OBI report from procurement. And although that encompasses the Amazon purchasing data plus other things, none of what's available in the OBI report goes beyond the segment. And so again, there's pros and cons to, maybe you want to look at the larger data set that includes purchasing not just from Amazon, but then you're going to maybe have to edit your goals a little bit if you were looking for trying to target very specific things. And obviously it's very different to know, you have a lot of items that are being purchased in office equipment and supplies versus you're buying a lot of markers. It's kind of a really big difference. The other thing to consider before I go back, continue to the case study, is there's an inherent error that's present with these UNSPSC codes. They are human inputted into Amazon by the vendors, and there's not much validation that occurs on the Amazon side. And so you will end up running into the case where something is marked as an office equipment or food or paper, and it's not. It's something completely different. And so it is important to kind of be aware of that distinction. And if you're doing something where like accuracy really matters, to be able to take that into consideration. So now kind of using this UNSPSC codes, I was able to kind of pull out just the food purchases through Amazon and use it kind of as a case study. This is all the food that was purchased through Amazon for Stanford in 2019. Basically the UNSPSC codes for food, I'll start with 50. And then in analyzing this data for Amazon, I came to the realization that most of this food being purchased through Amazon was actually for snack rooms and some small events. And so by using the UNSPSC codes, I was able to then narrow down this humongous data set, which started out with over 130,000 items to just 16,000. So it's much more manageable. And then I used a Python-based categorization tool that I developed for kind of other parts of my thesis to be able to assign emissions to the weights of the foods purchased through Amazon. And just a quick plug, this categorization tool is available at the website here, and I can put a link in the chat later if anyone's interested. I'm happy to talk more about that offline or at the end if there's interest. But so the fact that kind of these food purchases done through Amazon are oftentimes for snacks kind of explains this very unusual breakdown in purchases for food. I've also done quite a bit of looking at food purchasing for the dining halls. And obviously that breakdown of what's being purchased is very different. And so here on the left, you can see the weights of the foods that were purchased, and on the right is the carbon emissions. And here you can clearly see that, it's heavily skewed towards the purchases of liquids, which I found out is actually mostly water and soda. There's also lots of coffee and tea and sugars, which include things like candy. And so they make up about 75% of the weight, also about 75% of the carbon emissions, which comes out to just below 15 metric tons of CO2. So that's, in 2019, just for the food from Amazon. So obviously this adds up pretty quick. And kind of looking at this piece, I realized, hey, what are all these liquids we're purchasing, right? Because that might be a really good place to dig a little bit deeper and see if we can reduce maybe that purchasing, reduce the emissions, and reduce the waste that's produced from purchasing these things that maybe we don't even need. So here I have kind of the breakdown of the liquids versus, or the liquids for Amazon as well as SmartMart. And you can see that kind of soda and water make up a large percentage of both of these data sets for the liquids, and the liquids already made up a large percentage of the food, and the food made up a large percentage of the total things being purchased. And so obviously I think most universities at this point have, water fountains. We don't need to be buying, bottled water for snacks or events. And so I think that this is the water piece is kind of a big, easy, low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing waste, is, encouraging people, maybe talking to Amazon or vendors to see if there are ways to kind of limit the amount of water, or, ask people again, like, hey, are you sure you want to get water? You want to buy a bottle of water? And there's also, the options for, sodas. Maybe you can have some kind of system with a dining hall or something like that, where, purchasing and transporting the concentrated syrups is obviously less wasteful and less carbon intense than actually transporting, the like 2-liter bottles or even the smaller bottles. And so there might be some opportunity to, either partner with the dining halls or create a space on campus where departments and event planners can, have there's reusable bottles. They grab the soda, use it at the event, and then return the reusable bottles or something like that. And so it's pretty exciting that with, taking a data-driven approach, you can kind of make more targeted decisions to focus on these kind of key contributors for emissions and waste reductions across campuses. So really quickly, kind of in conclusion, I think it's really important to define a goal at the outset and make sure that the data set that you're using is the most effective one to help you reach those goals. And that can be a little hard, but I know with some conversation and some partnerships like the ones that Brian and Emma have, I think that makes it a lot easier. The UNSPSC codes can be really useful in kind of giving you a way to break up your data set into smaller, more manageable chunks. It definitely helped me a lot. And basically diving into categories can then help you eliminate opportunities for kind of this waste and emissions reductions. So with that, thank you all for your attention and for the opportunity to speak with you all. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. My email's up there as well. And then just in case you're interested in the food categorization website, that's the link there.
Yeah, I do think we have some people already asking for that tool. So if you want to share that in the chat or something,
sure.
That would be awesome. We have some good questions here. And to start, for those who don't have expertise or familiarity with the data streams, especially with something like Python, how would you suggest that other institutions pursue this kind of analysis? Like starting off, like where would you look? What are the big categories, or what kind of departments or resources were available for you at Stanford that helped you get started looking into this kind of area where we can work on reducing our impact?
Yeah, so I work really closely with the Stanford Office of Sustainability, and they in turn have a close partnership with procurement. And this is something that I got very lucky that this partnership started before I actually arrived. And so there were already conversations. And so as I started looking at the data and I started asking more questions, the Office of Sustainability could then go back to procurement and say like, hey, is this possible? Is that possible? Can we change this moving forward? And so I think the communication between the departments is really important. If you don't know Python, the script that I made is Python based, but you don't have to know Python to use it. But the other option is, a lot of this, I didn't actually know Python starting my master's. I technically knew it, but I wasn't comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. And so I did a lot of just tools with Excel. So all of these data sets, when you download them, At least in the case for Stanford, they all come in a huge Excel sheet. And so you can use, filters, or you can do some really like simple logic. So like, for example, you can have an equal sign, if you're looking at the food, all the UNSPSC codes start with 50 and then 6 zeros. So you can add a new column to your data set, just say like, if the value of whatever column is the UNSPSC code is greater than 50,000 and less than 60,000, say yes, and then you can filter it that way. And so there's lots of like kind of simple tricks that are super useful to know in Excel, which can really help you kind of manage that.
Awesome. And what do you see as like next steps for this work, especially at Stanford? Like, what is your hope, and how do you think this kind of data and research could be used to change policies at Stanford?
Yeah, so I'm really hopeful that this can like get people excited and see that there's actually, that I'm a very quantitative person, and so I like making decisions based on data. A lot of times people, there's people oftentimes talk about how like, oh, the straw thing didn't actually do much. It's good to kind of start the impulse and to get people thinking, but like if you look at the amount of emissions that using metal straws instead of plastic straws did isn't actually huge. And so kind of showing people that these opportunities exist, I think is really exciting. I'm continuing to work with the Office of Sustainability. This is just a piece of my research. So my goal is not really to reduce waste per se. I'm actually looking more at the emissions piece. And so we're still looking at basically talking with vendors and doing a lot of the same stuff that Brian and Emma are doing at MIT. But we're approaching it more from an emissions standpoint than a waste one. But with all of this that I've been doing, with looking at the data, et cetera, I've found several kind of pieces that are lacking in terms of where we could get better data in order to be better equipped to make better decisions in the future. And so I've also been kind of flagging those with the Office of Sustainability in order to hopefully be able to kind of put those into the contracts going forward, such that better data can be gotten in the future and more things can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you, I know it's a little bit off topic, but I think we'd all love to hear about the emissions piece and like what, maybe some big takeaways about what you've learned there so far and how the Office of Sustainability at Stanford is using that moving forward.
Yeah, so kind of on the emissions piece, what I'm studying is actually looking at the differences in calculated emissions if you use a weight-based emissions factor versus a spend-based emissions factor. So basically that's like this many kilograms of CO2 per dollar spent in this category or per pound purchased of this item. And so I'm kind of looking at that, and I'm still not quite done, but it seems like there is kind of a difference in those emissions that you calculate with the two factors. And so that kind of highlights these important questions to be asking, because there's kind of a lot of public institutions use kind of weight-based emissions factors, and a lot of private institutions use spend-based emissions factors. So that kind of gives an inherent difference in like what these two types of entities are calculating. There are lots of similarities and parallels that can be done between waste and emissions. But there's also, some interesting opportunities for trying to bring things in bulk and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for showing us this, especially with the data being such a useful tool, and like seeing like how you can break it down and being like, we could stop buying this water and like it's not necessary. Like this is something that is very actionable. So appreciate you showing us that. And on that idea, there's a question here about banning and discouraging bottled water purchasing and implementing that. I mean, if Emma's still here and willing to hop on like ideas about that, and if that's something that you've thought about at MIT or have suggestions for people to get started on, I'd love to hear about that as well. Emma?
Oh yeah, sure. I can speak to that. So at MIT, we very much have, or at least my office, we emphasize this idea of a culture of choice. So when we're thinking about sustainable purchasing, someone asks like if we have any policies in place, and it's really a hearts and mind campaign with every administrative unit. So fortunately, Brian's done a ton of the legwork, and I just get to take advantage of what he's built up over a long career. But when it comes to bottled water, we have a couple of central contracts that we manage with two large bottled water or water vendors. And what we've been doing is trying to negotiate the price on filtered options, as well as present a wider range of options that may incentivize folks to move from bottled water towards those filtered options, especially in their office spaces in their kitchens. Then I think one of our departments wants to go ahead and just ban bottled water outright. And we're probably going to be working with them over the next semester to think about how one does that. From my experience, banning bottled water just encourages people to drink more soda because that's what's available in vending machines. So there's kind of this like catch-22 of doing something like that. Like it's really great, obviously, but then you have to think about some of the other impacts as well. So which is where these filters come in. We have a lot of really great options through our vendors with those.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Yeah, and maybe Brian, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and Rebecca, thanks for your presentation. I mean, when you were an undergrad at MIT, I think you learned really well, like the importance of that data-driven, that data sort of driven component. And like Rebecca's efforts at MIT to really try to hone in on data to drive the solution and now what Rebecca's doing at Stanford, and it's the same message that we're learning with this like plastic question as an example. Let's start with the data. Let's start with a school. Let's start with a department and really understand what's the data of consumption and what's the viable alternative to shift from that consumption pattern. Without the data, this just becomes a game of anecdotes. And for our data-driven communities, we really need that data to help shift the behavior. So we're starting to open up some efforts with one of our schools that's really interested in trying to understand how to design out plastics. We're starting with what's our consumption footprint from a plastic point of view, and then we can start to shift from there. So the data is essential, and that's the best starting place, at least in our communities, I would imagine.
And there were a couple of people who asked how you get your Amazon data. If you're admin on your account, just go to your name, scroll down to where business analytics is, and it's right in there. It says like reports. You can base it all on like orders and all kinds of things. So you have to be an admin on your VA account.
Absolutely. And maybe that's something that you can work on getting started working with a purchasing department if you're in sustainability, and vice versa, back and forth. Thank you all for your presentations. We are gonna do some quick announcements and then we'll let you all go. So thank you so much for joining us today. Some quick announcements. We have sent out the annual Kirk members survey to learn about you, our audience, what we can do better as an organization. We're asking you where you want to see Kirk go in the future. So we really want your input. Like we said before, it's a member-based organization, so it's really important to us. So please take a few minutes to fill it out. You can find that on our website. And also coming up very soon, we're really excited to host the next members meeting. We do this once a year. It's a great opportunity to get together, network, and more directly talk about what Kirk wants to do in 22. Like we'll talk about our future webinar topics and vote on those, as well as some broader ideas about where we want to see Kirk go in the future. So please register for that. You can find that registration on our website if you haven't already gotten an email about it. So that's really exciting. And then next year, our webinars are still getting decided on, but some really exciting ones. We talked about a single-use plastic ban. We're going to talk about that in February. And then in April, some of Rebecca's colleagues are going to talk about Scope 3 emissions. So look out for that. So those are some early topics, but there's still a lot of ideas on the table for us to be talking about for next year's webinars. So, but once you leave the webinar today, you'll be prompted to take a quick survey. Please tell us about your experience today. Share your thoughts with us. So it'll help us improve our webinars moving forward. And don't forget to register for that members meeting. We'd love to see you all there. And so one last time, join me in thanking Brian, Emma, Rebecca, for their presentations and all the hard work they do at their respective institutions. It's really, really lovely to have you all and to learn from you today. You can look for their presentations and a recording of the program on the Kirk website, which is again www.curc3r.org within the next day or so. So have a good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.